So I would like to introduce the panelists briefly. I'll give a bit of a background like Matt McKinney did. Then I'll turn the conversation over to the panelists, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. So I'd like to introduce to you Dion Kilsback, who is currently an associate at Rosette LLP, former general counsel for the Jicarilla Apache Nation, and last but not least, senior counselor to the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, where he's worked on bison issues in actually all of these capacities to some degree. Then we also have our very own, not the law school, but the University of Montana, Dave Naugle. He's a professor of wildlife biology here at the University of Montana. And we asked him to be on the panel especially because of his extraordinary leadership on the sage grouse initiative and what he can bring to the table in discussing sage grouse issues and success there. Then we also are lucky enough to have Paul Kibel, who's a professor at the Golden Gate University. He also directs the Golden Gate University Center on Urban and Environmental Law. I look forward to his conversation and stories on salmon and hydropower. So thank you to Matt McKinney for framing the conversation this morning, Transcending Boundaries, Achieving Success in Cooperative Management of Natural Resources, focused on water. The fabulous panelists put details on and added context to that conversation. On this panel, we turn to wildlife, a natural for transboundary discussions. As we all know, wildlife rarely adheres to political or jurisdictional boundaries. You can't talk wildlife without talking habitat. We also know that climate change, whether it's a catalyst, we'll talk about that. We know that climate change is adding stressors to many species, posing additional challenges to wildlife management, not only diminishing habitat, fragmented habitat, but also changing or redistribution of habitat. So this fits well within Matt McKinney's framing of what we mean by transboundary. But with wildlife, we're going to add a little bit of spice to that special recipe. We'll add a component to transboundary, to what we mean by transboundary. We'll add that cross-cultural component. We'll add the concept of shared regulatory space. Think about the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. Think about statutes that address wildlife. They're cross-cutting. They apply to all agencies, all jurisdictions. So it's well understood with wildlife conservation that wildlife conservation necessarily requires cooperation amongst tribal, state, local government, federal agencies with disparate charges, private land ownership, private interests, environmental interests, industry interests, recreation. So to talk about wildlife, you've got to include all of those different interests and jurisdictions. Think about it. Very few species remain in one little area. Don't they cross private, public land, public, tribal, private land? There are only very few species that stay in one specific spot. So as we go into today's conversation about transboundary issues and cooperative success stories, we go into the conversation understanding that wildlife is necessarily an interdisciplinary and transboundary topic. So the speakers today, our panelists, exemplify what creative problem solvers can do. They add to today's inquiry by teaching us about their success stories and giving us lessons to learn from them. They offer 3 stories, 3 perspectives about 3 species, bison, salmon, and sage grouse. So I will introduce, or I've just introduced the speakers. I will ask the speakers to set the tone for the panel and discuss what success means to them or what success means to their topic, to so lay that groundwork of what we're talking about when we discuss success and wildlife stories. Then we'll turn to each of them for their presentations and follow up with questions. So what do you, I'll turn to them each and then come up. Paul, how do you define success? And what does success mean when you're talking about salmon, do you think?
Well, I'll speak specifically to salmon, but I think in the context of wildlife, I would define success as sort of scientifically driven, grounded ecological restoration of the species. Regardless of the process that we get there, if the outcome is that we have the protections in place so that they're not merely continually teetering on the edge of extinction, but are actually fully restored so they're not endangered, however we get there, I would define that as success for salmon and I think the other species we're talking about too.
Great. Dave.
Wildlife conservation is a social experiment, and finding innovative ways to involve all stakeholders that can bring a stronger outcome to long-term conservation is the trick in the game that we play every day. And the dirty secret is that we'll never be done working with conservation-reliant species. And so involving all those publics and finding that solution is our job.
Dion.
Good morning. When I think of success, it reminds me of the movie Jurassic World. And Chris Pratt, actually was pretty accurate in what he told about the genetic modification of a super dinosaur. It's that man cannot control. Nature is nature. And what we as humans do, try to control by destruction. And so, echoing my colleagues here, it's the notion that we strike that balance not only with nature, but within ourselves as individuals. So, to me, that's success.
Great. So I look forward to, at the end of the panel, weaving those themes into the list we're already building for that secret sauce. Because I hear components of actually the humanity. It's the piece we haven't talked about that much yet. We added in science and outcomes. That came out of the last panel as well. And that we're never done. That's a difficult conversation and one that I hope we get to further. So with that beginning, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Dave Noggle to talk about sage grouse.
On September 22nd, about 10 days ago, on the beautiful backdrop of the Rocky Mountain front, the Fish and Wildlife Service determined that through policy changes and unprecedented voluntary actions, we've obviated the need to list greater sage grouse as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. On stage was a host of high-ranking state and federal officials. Amongst them was one rancher standing at the podium with the green tie, and they gave Dwayne Coombs, a public land rancher from Nevada, 3 minutes. And Dwayne got up and he said he bought a new tie, and it's the first time he's had a suit on since he got married. And he said, I'm gonna tell you a story of two 11-year-olds. And he said, one is me and one is Desi, my 11-year-old daughter, pictured here. And he said as he was growing up, he learned distrust of government from his dad. And he said, I remember vividly the federal government came into our watershed, and in a period of extreme drought, they bought out all the cattle to get money back into the community. And he said, as an 11-year-old, they hired me to take all of the cattle in the watershed, drive them 15 miles north into a drainage where they proceeded to shoot them all. And he said, my best friend was also hired as a kid, my age, and he said he tried hard to pull the family milk cow out of the herd prior to the shooting, and he said, what I remember most was the federal official taking him and backing him off, saying, we own these cattle now, boy. And he said, that's how I grew up. But he said, today, with the non-listing and the proactive conservation and how these communities have come together through policy and voluntary conservation, he said, we are breaking down generations of distrust. And he said, my daughter, Desi, will not know this now in her lifetime. And he said, she goes out and removes problem fences, marks and moves fences so that sage grouse don't strike them. And pictured here, one of her best friends is a USGS biologist that takes her out catching sage grouse and putting radio collars on them to monitor the health of that bird as an indicator to our human health and the health of that system that everybody lives in. I think what Dwayne's excited most about as a rancher is he sees a sea change coming. He's living it through his own actions in our approach to the Endangered Species Act. And so I'll propose to you today that we're going to add a variable to the equation of the Endangered Species Act. It used to be, and the intent of the act was written to conserve ecosystems. Somewhere we started working on individual species. The traditional regulatory approach was identify a problem, undergo a policy change, and hopefully achieve recovery. And this worked great for things like American alligator, where we said we can't make as many purses because we're shooting too many. And then for species like peregrine and bald eagles and other raptors, we had to get rid of DDT, which was causing eggshell thinning, and we changed the policy and recovered those populations. But with human population growth, additional fragmentation, it's not as easy as it used to be. And so now 84% of the species on the ESA list are what are termed conservation reliant. And in my opening remark, I said that the dirty secret is if we want these critters on the planet, we're never done with conservation. And our trick is to figure out how to bring all of those common interests together to keep those landscapes large and intact. And what Dwayne's excited about is this additional term called voluntary conservation in the equation. And so forget the false narrative that it's either voluntary actions or it's top-down regulatory policy. We need policy, but we need those other communities involved in voluntary actions at the table, or we're not going to win. To take you out to western landscapes, the 165 million acres of sagebrush systems, our new mapping science of mesic areas or wetlands, like we heard about in the first panel, that's where sage grouse take those little white puffballs and they grow them up into adults. So they nest in the dry uplands. And 80% of those habitats, BLM, Forest Service, where the nesting occurs, are on public lands. But this transboundary idea today is relevant here because then 80% of those wet, most productive areas that was historically settled first in the West, they're all private land. And so any policy we do on public land, but we don't appreciate how that integrates into rural ways of life and ranching, is an incomplete approach. Studied this critter in this system for about 15 years. I think the science is the easy part. It's the human dimensions that's the tough part. I can boil our science work into one slide. These critters hate fragmentation. It's a 20th century bird wrapped up in a 21st century fragmented landscape by humans. Whether it's a diesel tractor in eastern Montana turning sagebrush grazing lands into a black dirt wheat field, if it's subdivision that's putting houses and cement where habitat was before, or if it's encroaching conifer, places these trees don't belong, turning a rangeland into a forest. If you squint your eyes, the relationship on the y-axis, which is declining number of birds, is the x-axis of increasing fragmentation. They all look like a hockey stick. And so for sage grouse and so many of our other western wildlife critters, you got to get on top of fragmentation early and often if you want to keep these intact systems that these big charismatic species that we all move to the west and want to have in our lives. Enter the sage grouse initiative. In 2010, on the heels of the Fish and Wildlife Service putting sage grouse as a candidate, perhaps this was our catalyst. The next day, the chief of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the branch of USDA that manages the conservation title of the Farm Bill, said, let's see what we can do to change the arc of peril that sage grouse in our western rangelands are in. And so we do three things with Sage Grouse Initiative, or SGI. First, remove habitat fragmenting threats to grouse while improving ranch sustainability. Number two is implement enough of those right conservation actions in the right places to benefit populations. And then third, as the panelists said, assess the effectiveness through science, quantify those benefits, and if we're not getting the job done, to tweak program delivery. Here's the kinds of things that we do in SGI. Improve rangeland health through sustainable grazing systems. Number two, conservation easements, which we heard about in the first panel, to reduce fragmenting effects of things like subdivision, cultivation. Remove encroaching conifer. These birds, I'll talk about it in a minute, they hate these tall structures. These trees are growing in places where they shouldn't be. We go down, we cut them out, and it provides instant habitat. Lastly, marking high-risk fences. These birds, when they fly into their leks in the pre-dawn morning to do breeding and that fancy dance that you've seen on YouTube, they can't see these high-risk fences. If you simply put markers on them, like you can see in the upper right, a 87% reduction in bird strikes. When we first got going, we needed a business model. We needed a biological game plan to do this. I won't bore you with the details, but we did a fancy GIS analysis and basically showed that 75% of the birds are in 25% of the habitat area. So now, as a business model, we know if you're going to spend $1, we know where to do it to benefit 500 birds instead of 5 birds. And so if you look at this picture, think of you're watching the Weather Channel at home. The higher intensity storms, the darker colors, are where the majority of these native populations are located. So now we're working in 20 or 30 million acres instead of 165 million acres. It makes a much easier way to take a bite of the cookie. And that targeted investment strategy gives you that higher biological return on investment. Since we created these biological tools, states, all of these other partners have sort of agreed upon these purple areas. They call them PACs, priority areas for conservation. The threats that we ameliorate through policy and voluntary conservation vary widely across the West. If you're in the Great Basin, you're looking at removing invasive conifer. Catastrophic wildfire is a huge deal. Cheatgrass invasion. If you're more in the eastern part of the West, it's cultivation risk in eastern Montana, infrastructure, energy development, subdivision. SGI works on that voluntary side of the equation. I have time, 10 minutes of comments to show you one of those. I picked conifer removal for today. Here's a stage 2 invaded native rangeland. To a rancher, under those trees that aren't supposed to be there is black dirt. It's lower animal unit per month. It's less forage to graze, and he's impacting his profitability. To a sage grouse, every one of those trees could have a predator. We've done the science. I'll show you a graphic here in a minute. At 4% canopy cover, there's no more birds that use that landscape. If you can go in and remove those trees proactively, cost share it with a landowner through the Farm Bill, they match it with 25% of their resources, you can make instant habitat on millions of acres. Take a peek at this. This is before, and in 1 year, that's after. That's native rangeland, that's sage grouse habitat, and it's something that a rancher would be proud of to increase his own sustainability and economic success on his ranch. Poor slide of eastern Oregon in the lower left. Those priority areas are the white blobs. Each dot is a conifer removal project we've done just in this one state. Notice how the big dots are 10,000 acre treatments, And notice how we group them up into watersheds. And so it's not a one-off individual postage stamp approach. It's working with the community, establishing that conservation partnership, and then improving the entire watershed. Here's a graphic that shows acreage on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. The agency, the partnership used to do a few of these removal projects. Before SGI, during SGI, look at the exponential growth in the application of this one practice. That's how you affect whole landscapes, watersheds, communities, economic sustainability. Absolutely skyrocketed through time. People talked about outcomes. And they said, what is the outcome? And so we spend a lot of time in science looking at what are these biological outcomes? Are they working? And so we've got published science that shows when you remove those conifer, you can keep sage grouse on the landscape. But it's not about an individual species. It's about ecosystems and long-term sustainability. We started another study that just got completed, showing here, what about all those little songbirds that a segment of society loves? And so brewer sparrow, green-tailed towhee in green and blue lines, uncut versus cut sites 1, 2, and 3 years later. In these areas where we've done management, there's 50 to 80% more of those songbirds. These are the critters that would be the next ones on the ESA chopping block and where the next bar fight would take place. Let's fix it all at the same time. People ask us, what about SGI in the future now that the listing is over? Does everybody fold up their tent and go home? Before Dwayne learned of the ESA determination 2 weeks ago in Denver, we already had the next Farm Bill allocation, $211 million in funding, with partners matching that to over $300 million through fiscal year 2018 in place. And you can see our investment strategy, what we're going to do next and where we're going to work. We've gotten so much better at this through time. It used to be that states would get their Farm Bill allocations every year, but imagine if you were trying to do conservation easements and you were doing a $5 million project and you needed partners to contribute $2.5 million of that. It takes longer than a year to come up with that through conservation partners. Now this strategy has a 4-year time frame, and if I tell you those dollars are coming to do that work, you can go work with your partnership to find the match, and it snaps together in a way it never did in the past. Here's what I think the real story is with voluntary conservation. Sage grouse isn't a one-off. If you look across the country, just since August 2014, voluntary conservation has played a huge role for all of the species pictured here. And I don't have time to tell you every story, but here's my closing thought. Fluvial Arctic grayling in southwest Montana, more water in the river, voluntarily put there by irrigators, and now we've conserved, and the service said there's no reason to list this species because the water's colder and the fish is safe. Oregon chub, the first fish ever recovered off of ESA, all due to voluntary conservation, delisted off of ESA in March 2015. Louisiana black bear, delisted in May 2015. Commodity prices, soybean prices were high, they deforested eastern Louisiana. It didn't work out. Partners working through the Farm Bill reforested Louisiana. We had 7 known black bears left, now there's over 700. Bi-state sage grouse, which is a distinct population segment of greater sage grouse, similar story straddling Nevada and California. In September, right before greater sage grouse decision, same thing for New England cottontail up in the northeastern states. Needed some sustainable forestry work done, worked with those private landowners, opened up some bunny habitat. And so, do you get rid of ESA? Do you crush policy? No. Do you find more partnerships and a better way of doing business? Absolutely. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Dave. So to oversimplify, to put too fine a point on it, to beat a dead horse, I want to follow up with going through those key ingredients to the special sauce and pull those themes out from what Dave just said. To remember, when we're talking about success, it can be different for different species, for different issues. And I heard you say that success in species conservation, we need to remember that it may mean going forward that we will still have conservation-dependent species. And just because they're conservation-dependent, that doesn't mean we can't have a success story. And one of the biggest successes in the sage grouse decision not to list is that it moved from this tunnel vision to a specific species and looked at the habitat and looked at all of these different efforts that could come into play. That's a success story in itself. And what were the components? The catalyst was at the deadline, the pending deadline 2 days ago of making a listing determination. Was it also science, understanding that we had a declining species? So maybe a couple catalysts. The messenger. You started right out with Dwayne Coombs. The messenger was so important here that it was a joint effort, that it wasn't just the federal government shoving a listing down everybody's throats. Creativity. You exemplify the sage grouse initiative, all of the different efforts that have gone into sage grouse conservation. That exemplifies that requisite creativity, the money that was brought to bear to support this, the agreements, conservation agreements, including conservation easements, and then the humanity, realizing who's driving the decision here, and that people had a say in driving the decision that would impact them, coupled with, I heard some really practical solutions, putting flags on fences, learning some of those very practical on-the-ground solutions that everybody could do. So with that, I can't wait to hear from you, Paul.
Thank you, Dave. That was a great presentation. So from the panel this morning on water resources, Jennifer Anders talked about the experience in the Pacific Northwest with dams and power and salmon, and noted that a lot of the dams that her work is focused on were built in the period, let's say, roughly from the 1930s to maybe the 1970s, a lot of the Bonneville Power era and all of that. You might take from that the lesson that this issue of conflicts between salmon and hydropower is a relatively recent phenomenon. And what I wanted to start is by highlighting that, in fact, that is not the case. The law has been struggling to reconcile sort of the relationship between salmon stocks and hydropower facilities for more than 200 years. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit historically about some of the experience between Scotland and England and the River Tweed, which forms the border between it. So the River Tweed on the east coast forms the border between Scotland and England and is one of the most productive salmon fisheries in the UK. And as its name suggests, it's closely associated with a lot of the woolen mills that were built up around that region. These woolen mills were powered by water wheels. And the way they operated is that they put impoundments in the river, which they called C-A-U-L-D, and they would divert the river next to the mill, which would then power the water wheel and return it. And to the consternation of many of the fishermen, a lot of these impoundments in the river, diverting for water wheel hydro, it's still hydro though, were blocking the upstream and downstream passage of salmon and sea trout in the area. So in 1807, a coalition of both recreational fly fishermen and commercial salmon fishermen, does this sound similar, got together and were able to secure passage in 1807 of the River Tweed Act. I'm not going to talk to you about all of it, but what I did want to read to you is some of this language in it, which I think is very pertinent to what I'm going to talk about later with the Federal Power Act. This is language in 1807. Article 11 of the River Tweed Act. It provides, quote, all milled, dam, dikes, weirs, and other permanent obstructions in the river to be altered or constructed to allow the free run of fish. If proprietors, occupiers do not comply, commissioners to give notice in writing to do so within 14 days. If nothing happens, commissioners may order the work to be done at the expense of the occupier or proprietor. So, one, the River Tweed Act remains in effect today and governs water management and fishery management on the River Tweed. But what I think is interesting is to realize that more than 200 years ago, we had provisions in law that provided that it was unlawful, illegal, to block upstream and downstream passage of salmon through hydro facilities. And moreover, that the financial obligation to correct that was on those that operated those facilities in stream. So with that sort of broader historical context in mind, my talk today is not going to be about the River Tweed Act, as exciting as that may be. I'm going to be talking about the Federal Power Act. And what I wanted to talk about in the theme of this conference is how the relicensing proceeding under the Federal Power Act, which applies to all non-federal dams on navigable waters, provides an interesting model and an interesting opportunity to address fish conservation measures. And to address it in a way that really allows for, at least jurisdictionally, cross-cutting between two federal agencies, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, and the wildlife agencies, Fish and Wildlife and NIMS, as well as interesting jurisdictional collaboration between state governments and the federal governments. So that's where I'm going. Okay. So to set up my talk today, there are really sort of two preliminary aspects that I need to touch on. The first is to have some general sense of sort of the life cycle and habitat needs of West Coast wild Pacific salmon. And the second is to understand some of the thinking in terms of salmon conservation that was prevalent when a lot of these dams were initially built. So West Coast salmon habitat needs. The first thing, which most of us understand, is that they're anadromous fish. They begin in freshwater, go out to the ocean, and return. So understanding that life cycle is sort of key to understanding the way that dams interact with it. There are sort of three aspects in particular that I want to focus on that are relevant to the FERC relicensing process. The first is that salmon need downstream and upstream passage to reproduce from wherever it is they're beginning. So obviously, heading downstream, dams can serve as obstacles in two ways. One, to the extent water is not being released from the dam, you have salmon moving downstream that are trapped in the waters behind the dam. Secondly, to the extent the waters are being released, they find themselves funneled through the turbines. And we're going to have lunch later, but you can figure out what happens when that happens. Secondly, we have issues of return passage, heading back upstream. They need methods, if they want to get to those spawning grounds up above the dam, methods to get there. So obviously, impoundments on stream dams have impacts both on downstream and upstream passage. The other effect relates to water temperatures. Salmon and other anadromous fish like steelhead trout, they're cold water fish, and they require a certain range of temperatures to be productive and survive. Ideal temperatures for salmon and steelhead trout, 55 degrees or even a little bit cooler. Between 55 and 60, we start to see significant increases in mortality, drop-offs in productivity. And once we start getting much above 60, they don't survive very much. So dams can have an influence on the temperature of waters below the dam, depending on the temperature of the water that's released and when it's released. If we have water temperatures that exceed the ability of salmon and steelhead to survive, it's going to impact them. And there's a term sometimes called spilling water. When you're letting water downstream that's not involved in generating electricity, the power industry would tend to review that as spilling water, but sometimes spilling that water is necessary to maintain the cold water habitat for the salmon. The last habitat need I'll mention relates to spawning really below the dam. Salmon like to spawn in relatively clear, shallow waters, and they like to spawn in waters where they have a certain type of gravel. One of the things that dams do is they trap gravel downstream. So the areas below the dam tend to be sort of gravel deprived, which affects the suitability of the habitat below the dam. Another problem with dams is that when they release it for power generation, it's at high velocity. So that can sort of scour the gravel, scour the eggs. So salmon and steelhead trout are also often looking for areas where there is less velocity, lower flows, so their eggs don't get washed out, so the gravel doesn't get washed out. How do they slow down that velocity? Often through the use of large, woody debris. So, but once again, some of that debris would naturally be washed downstream, is also getting trapped behind the dams. So as you think about salmon habitat issues, just in terms of habitat needs, you have issues of upstream and downstream passage, you have issues of gravel, and then you have issues, what I would call sort of large woody debris, which are all critical to them. Okay. So we did have a large, Jennifer was right largely. We did build a lot of these dams in that period, say from 1930 to 1970. And even at the time that we, is it not up? Oh, it's up for me. There really are pictures of salmon. It's a really pretty fish. So at the time these dams were constructed during this period, we already had pretty good information about the life cycle of salmon, and there was an understanding that, particularly in terms of upstream and downstream passage, yay, you missed all the good River Tweed stuff, but that we knew that these dams were going to cut off upstream and downstream passage for wild salmon stocks. But the focus at that time was not so much on how can we modify the design or operation of these dams to allow upstream and downstream passage. Rather, the scientific thinking of the time was to focus on hatchery salmon below the dam, and that you would develop hatcheries below the dam to supplement or offset or mitigate the lost wild salmon stocks. And that was really the assumption that most of these dams were built on. So there wasn't a lot of focus initially on looking at fish passage. The problem is that over time we have a pretty good body of scientific data that shows that the reliance, there we go, reliance. Got a ladybug? That's a good sign. That's a good sign.
For the wildlife camp.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That these hatchery programs have not been as successful, and there's sort of two reasons why the science has sort of borne this out. One is that it turns out that when you release hatchery salmon from their sort of captive environment into the wild, they're in a particularly aggressive state, and they tend to outcompete wild salmon. So actually it's not like there's two separate groups. The actual release of the hatchery salmon in many situations has been shown to sort of decimate or lead to the decline of the wild salmon stocks because they outcompete them. The other problem is that there's a fairly well-settled body of scientific data which shows that although they outcompete in the early stages of their life, they tend not to have lower survival rates when they're out in the wild, and they tend not to reproduce as well. So you put those two things together, we had a system that was focused on hatchery salmon that hasn't really done the job, and we're still seeing continued decline of stocks. So how does this relate to FERC relicensing? Well, why this relates, and I'll talk about this, is that we now have science which shows that extensive reliance on hatchery as a way to offset the losses of wild salmon stocks has not worked particularly well, and in some sense may have actually contributed to the further decline of those wild salmon stocks. So the question then becomes, when we're looking at the relicensing of hydro facilities, 30, 50 years later, how do we factor that science into the way we potentially modify the way those existing dams operate? All right, so Federal Power Act. Federal Power Act provides that licenses are issued to operators of hydroelectric facilities on navigable waters, non-federal operators. Doesn't apply to Army Corps reclamation. We can talk about that later if we want to. That was my question this morning. For periods of 30 to 50 years, and at that point they need to reapply to relicense the facility. And that's sort of where the rubber hits the road in terms of these salmon-related issues. Between 1990 and 2010, FERC relicensed 500 hydroelectric projects, and of these 500 relicensing proceedings, more than 40% of them involved improvements, either related to fish restoration, fish passage. So we can see that the FERC process is a real sort of focal point to address these concerns. In particular, there's a lot I could talk about with the FPA, but there are two provisions under Section 10 and Section 18. Section 10 of the FPA requires that a FERC license or relicense, quote, adequately and equitably protect, mitigate damages to, and enhance fish affected by the development or operation of the project. So that's an important provision. Section 18 provides that federal and state fish agencies, which will often be NIMS or Fish and Wildlife at the federal level, and a host of state agencies, may prescribe a facility for fish passage, operation, or maintenance. What's important about those two provisions of the FPA, Section 10 and Section 18, is that as part of the FERC relicensing process, FERC has to consult with state and federal wildlife agencies, and with very few limitations, FERC is required to accept the recommendations in terms of fish passage and fish conservation of those other agencies. So if you are an organization that's involved in trying to use the FERC relicensing process to improve the situation for salmon, a lot of the focus is on the positions that are going to be staked out or taken by either NIMS or Fish and Wildlife Service or by the state wildlife agencies that are involved. Another thing I'll mention, it's not on a slide, is that as part of the FERC relicensing under the Federal Clean Water Act, something called Section 401, they have to go through something called a 401 water quality certification process. And that means that if states where the dams are located believe that there's insufficient, let's say, releases of water to maintain water conditions, downstream water quality for fish, they can impact by either withholding or imposing conditions through their 401 water quality certification procedure. So once again, between the role of fisheries agencies and the role of states under the 401, you see there's a lot of potential, let's just say, leverage to use this process. So for the remaining time that I have, what I was going to try to do is get less abstract and give you three examples of how the relicensing process has played out. Two of them are California, and one of them is Oregon. So Oroville Dam is located on the Feather River in California. It's a tributary to the Sacramento River. The dam is operated by the California Department of Water Resources as part of the State Water Project. At 775 feet, I think it has the claim to being the tallest dam in the United States. It might, at least that's my understanding. Given the height of the dam, it was licensed in 1957, so around 2007 it came up for relicensing. Given the height of the dam, the prospect of installing fish ladders on a dam that height in that location was pretty low. But what the focus became was that this was one of these situations where they had hatcheries below the dam. Right now, hatchery fish are about 80% of the fish, partially because the hatchery fish have decimated the local wild salmon stocks. So rather than focusing on how can we expand the fishery program, the focus during the relicensing proceeding became on how can we really improve the wild salmon habitat below the dam. And two main things came out of that. One is they changed the flow schedule so that for the portions below the dam to the confluence with the Sacramento, there have requirements to maintain temperatures sort of below 56 degrees year-round. So the idea is that even if we're going to be spilling some water, we need to maintain the releases and flows to maintain appropriate water temperatures for salmon below the dam. So that was a big change, and that was driven through the relicensing proceeding. Second, a big program to, I think it was 8,500 cubic yards, 8,300 cubic yards of gravel are being supplemented below the dam to provide habitat for eggs, and several hundred pieces of large woody debris are being placed to sort of slow down the velocity of the work. So you see here, even without fish passage, the relicensing proceeding was used to get commitments from the operator of the dam, which is the state of California, to change its flow schedule for water temperature and take steps through gravel and woody debris to improve the habitat for salmon below the dam. Pelton Dam, Deschutes River, different situation. They actually had fish passage on the Pelton Dam, but it wasn't working very well. And one of the problems was the fish passage was relatively small, and the fish coming downstream could not find it. There were eddies happening, and the salmon were swimming around and actually couldn't find the downstream passage. So we can talk about whether this is a satisfactory result, but I'll simply explain it. Some people had talked about the need to expand the fish ladders, and that didn't happen. What did happen is they developed this rather elaborate underwater facility called the selective water withdrawal, where they're actually sort of redirecting the salmon downstream to a facility where they're going to be trucked below the dam for the downstream passage. It's a somewhat innovative, somewhat controversial measure. I think the science is still out as to how well it will work. But once again, I'm just explaining that the decision, and it's about a $150 million facility, so there's some real money to put it into play. All of this came about because of the FERC relicensing proceeding. The last one, and I should mention that I also work for a firm in the Bay Area called Water and Power Law Group, and we're involved in this, so wearing kind of two hats with this. But the Tuolumne River is a river that is tributary to the San Joaquin River in California, and a lot of people know about Hetch Hetchy and the dams way up on the Tuolumne. Further downstream, there's two dams, LaGrange and San Pedro. And right now, LaGrange and San Pedro have no fish passage. So there's a huge stretch between those dams and, let's say, Hetch Hetchy Valley, where there's no salmon. LaGrange is now coming up. It's a little bit complex to explain. It's actually coming up for initial licensing because of when it was built, but that's not actually really critical. What's critical is part of the licensing proceeding for LaGrange, the operator is required to state sort of what they propose to study environmentally. And in their initial program, they talked about helping supplement salmon habitat below the dam, but they didn't talk about anything in terms of upstream passage. And many environmental groups, including groups that my firm represents, as well as the National Marine Fisheries Service, weighed in and said there are a lot of indications that the habitat above the dam is prime steelhead and salmon habitat. So as part of your relicensing proceeding, we want you to study the suitability of the areas above the dam as salmon habitat, to which the operator said, but they don't have any passage. Why would we study that? To which FERC said, because it's a relicensing proceeding. And we can't know whether we want you to examine installing fish passage until we know how valuable it is. So as a result of NIMS weighing in very strongly, and I think other environmental groups weighing in very strongly, earlier this year, FERC ordered them to do fish passage and habitat studies for the areas above the dam. We don't know yet what the result of that is going to be, but the mere fact that the FERC process served as a mechanism to get these issues studied and addressed, I think is once again an example of how it can be used in this context. So I'm almost out? I'll go quickly. 5 minutes? Okay, I have a little bit more time. The other thing I was going to mention is there's something called the Low Impact Hydropower Institute, pronounced LIHI, not Lehigh, but it's LIHI. And they have been involved in sort of environmental certification for hydro facilities, both for new and for relicensing. And this is also an interesting mechanism. I'm not going to go into too much detail about their program, but part of the criteria for being certified as a low-impact hydropower facility relates to healthy river flows and effective fish passage. And in particular, they've grounded their certification process on the extent, in sort of two ways. One, the extent to which FERC fully adopted the recommendations of the fishery agency, state and federal. To the extent they pushed back against it or accepted half of them, that's usually a classic reason to deny certification. And the other is they had some more objective criteria. So the LIHI standards are sort of another way that sort of overlays the traditional certification proceeding. I think that is interesting. So, you know, I think the takeaway, and we can explore some more of these issues during the discussion, is that, you know, I think there's a tendency to think of dams as sort of permanent fixtures of the landscape, almost as natural elements of the landscape. And I think the FERC relicensing process provides sort of a counterbalance to that. There may have been reasons why they were built the way they were and certain scientific assumptions that made sense at that time. But we know a lot more now. And in particular, I think, we know a lot more about the relationship between hatchery programs, salmon hatchery programs, and wild salmon stocks than we did in the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s. So to the extent we're going through the relicensing proceeding and we're relying on the same mitigation that we used in the 1930s that we now know didn't work, the relicensing proceeding provides an opportunity to really revisit these issues, I think, with fresh eyes and with better science. And I don't see U.S. hydro policy moving quite the direction of the River Tweed. But I still think the example with the River Tweed is interesting. It's interesting because I think sometimes there's notions that this focus on conservation, biodiversity, environmental concerns are relatively new, something that sprung out of the 1960s and Earth Day. And it's important to realize, one, that historically that's actually not true, that the language that I read to you came from 1807. And there were already concerns about the effects of hydro and in-stream facilities on salmon stocks that were being addressed more than 200 years ago. The other thing I'll mention, which may tie in with Dave's a little bit, and this may be more peculiar to the salmon situation, is that I think sometimes we end up in debates over environment versus biodiversity conservation. With salmon and with steelhead trout, we have a very vibrant commercial fishery sector. And we also have a very vibrant fly fishing, sports fishing sector. So the way these debates play out around salmon and hydro are not simply environment versus jobs. They're jobs versus jobs. Whose jobs versus other people's jobs? And I'll just mention this because it's sort of a personal thing. There's a group on the West Coast called the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Association, PCFFA, very, very involved in hydro relicensing issues because they represent commercial fishermen, and they've been a very effective advocate. The president of PCFA, Zeke Rader, just passed away 2 weeks ago. So I guess this notion of sort of the role of commercial fishermen, not simply biodiversity in this, which seems to have some parallels with what you're talking about in terms of the ranchers, I think that's important to keep in mind as we think about salmon and hydro relicensing. Okay. Should I take this down?
Thank you, Paul. He couldn't have more perfectly illustrated how these natural resource issues, especially wildlife issues, they're not one size fits all. They can be so different scales, different parties. And so if we try to apply that special sauce the same way to all of them, I don't know that we would reach success. But I heard here, for a very historic wildlife problem, the impact of dams on the habitat needs of salmon specifically. In a way, the catalyst, the messenger, and the forum were all bound together. The catalyst is relicensing, but the forum perhaps is the FERC relicensing process. The messenger is relicensing again, right? How to be creative within the process you have. And so I love that it illustrates that we come at these natural resources issues and potential solutions in so many different ways. Next, we have Dion Kilsback, who I know will only illustrate that even further.
Pevia chef, Pevia miss nas chisave. The wumpo matanehif. Good morning, everybody. Actually, it's afternoon, it's lunch. I know you guys are probably thinking we got to get out of here, we got to eat, so bear with me. What I said is my name is Walks Good. That's my Northern Cheyenne name. I'm from Busby, Montana, and I'm a graduate of the Alexander Blewett III Law School, School of Law. Actually, it was just called School of Law when I graduated. But if I get a $10 million honorarium to the law school, I'm sure they'll change it in my name. If that happens, okay. But for now, I want to say thank you to the Public Law Land Review for inviting me back. It was great to be here this summer. I taught the American Indian Law and Natural Resources course. I see some of my students. I see Megan and some of the folks out there. Good to see you all again. And taking time out of your Friday afternoon lunchtime to spend that with me for a few minutes to talk about bison. transcending boundaries is the theme, and Martha did a really good job. Just so you know, Martha and I work together at the Department of Interior, and for those of you that were here last night to hear the solicitor Hillary Tompkins speak, it was a great talk, and we were lucky to have her for that short period of time, and she did a really good job. I did an abstract, and let's see here, where are we going? Space. And that's essentially my abstract, and it talks about the bison move that took place back in 2012 in January, but it culminated in 2011. And I think for those of you that went on the tour yesterday, this picture just really captures the theme for the bison and what it means not only for Native Americans, but also for American history. So, as you know, American history, manifest destiny, the Indian problem, the Indian wars, the bison were the pinnacle or the source of life for many of American Indians, especially on the plains. And so the U.S. government policy was to put Indians on a reservation, or what many consider engage in a anti-Indian policy of assimilation and eradication. And they really couldn't do that on the battlefield because Indians, this was their home court. We had home court advantage. And so they engaged in another type of warfare, which is we'll kill off their food source. And that's exactly what happened. And so estimates, put bison roaming on the Great Plains of around 40 million. And if you guys were on the tour, yesterday that amongst the Confederate states in Kootenai, the name for them means little black dots. Little black dots meaning that they speckled the landscape because they were in such great numbers. And so I talk about that because that sets the stage for the history, and lead into where we are now, or recently, in the recent history. And the policies changed with more education, obviously, and the acceptance that Indian people, Indian tribes aren't going anywhere. And so the boundaries that we're talking about, as discussed in our previous presentations, wildlife really don't care about these imaginary borders or lines. But my role as a former federal official within the Department of Interior, we do have boundaries. And so I want to kind of paint that picture based on the overall structure of the Department of Interior's hierarchy. So this is the basic structure that Hillary Tompkins laid out yesterday so eloquently, but I have a nice little graph because I don't have it memorized like she does. So the secretary at the time was obviously Ken Salazar, former Colorado Attorney General, Senator, and then Deputy Secretary David Hayes, and then obviously solicitor to the right is Hillary Tompkins. Below that, you have the 5 dark blue boxes. Those are what we call the Big Five in Interior. And these guys are also Senate-appointed, presidentially nominated, and Senate-confirmed. So for the Assistant Secretary for Fish, Wildlife Service, and Parks, we had Rachel Jacobson. And for the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, we had Larry Elkahawk. We also had for Land and Minerals, we had actually Neil Cornsey is sitting there now, and then for Water and Science, Ann Castle. For Insular Affairs, Martha, tell me. So see, that's how small they were they were really that big. Okay, so she doesn't remember, I don't feel that bad. Okay, so, yeah. So, and then below that, you have the Bureau of Indian Affairs within Indian Affairs, and that we have Director Mike Black, who is the former regional director from Billings, Montana, and a member of the Sioux tribe. And then for the National Park Service, we have John Jarvis, the National Park Service Director. And with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we have Mr. Dan Ash. So the guys in the blue, the big five, those are all, politicals. There's a hierarchy in D.C. Politicals meaning that you come in as part of the administration, the new administration, the Obama administration. Obviously, above the secretary, you have President Obama. That's the White House. He's like number 6 or 7 in line in the event Biden and the speaker go down in a plane crash or something. So that was pretty neat to know that Salazar could be in line some way, shape, or form. So these are the boundaries that we're talking about, and these are the lanes. And these boundaries that existed, these little pockets or these little squares are literally their sandboxes of jurisdiction in terms of what is National Park Service land, what is National Wildlife Refuge land, and for Bureau of Indian Affairs, what is tribal trust land, whether it's allotted reservation land. And each sandbox has its own bucket of funds, each bucket of money that is guided by OMB, which in DC for us as policymakers and attorneys is really a 4-letter word nowadays, because they're really tough to get along with for those very reasons. So wind the clock back a little bit, about 18 years, 19 years, 1996. Who remembers that winter? It was pretty cold here in Montana. We were about 20 below, 30 below for about a month or 6 weeks on end. I was a freshman at the other university in Bozeman, Montana, and we were studying fish, wildlife, and biology. And the Yellowstone National Park was making national news. U.S. Today, Dan Rather had made all appearances there because of the bison slaughters, the slaughters that were taking place. The governor at the time, Mark Roscoe, was in the press. We had the crazy lady trying to throw buffalo guts on him, made national news. So that's kind of the history, to kind of paint a picture of what was the issue then. And that was the bison at Yellowstone National Park leaving national park lands to find food. And finding food because the Park Service had reached its threshold and was no longer to support the bison. So the biological aspect is that the bison would leave to find food because they need food in order to survive. However, Montana at the time had an issue with bison because of the potential for encroachment on domestic cattle lands, range lands, meaning that that's food for domestic cattle, and an impact competition, as we discussed a little bit, job versus job. It's food or income for cattle growers, cattle operators, losing out because of a wild animal that would outcompete its domestic counterpart, the bovine or cattle. And so it engaged in a practice of killing a bison in order to prevent that competition from taking place. Over 1,000 bison were slaughtered. Some of the meat was made it to local processors, to local shelters for those unfortunate or needing protein sources. Some tribes also participated in the harvest. But the public outcry was, this is terrible. The National Park Service is doing a great job in building up this species that was once almost extinct. And now we have today, or back then, 18 years ago, a practice of slaughtering them again. So the policy changed. We need to figure something out. Integrated Bison Management Plan, IMBP, was established. And so the issue came up. Now, while we can't really transplant bison, we need to take care of a very, very deadly disease, brucellosis, which turns out isn't really that deadly. But it was a concern that it involved the development of a quarantine process and protocol where any bison that were to be leave the park would be quarantined for an X amount of number of years and tested subsequently to ensure a brucellosis-free status, and then transport. So these facilities were set up north of the Park Service in Gardner, in the valley, and then after that, okay, great, that's fine. I'm oversimplifying this, and believe me, there's a lot more literature on this, and there are experts that are far more versed at this than I am. And for those of you that were in my class this summer, know that the Confederation Kootenai tribes, we have two of the most, I consider the most what I consider respected attorneys within that realm, Mr. Harrison and Mr. Brian Upton from the Confederation Kootenai tribes, very expert. So we came back to Interior after all that history. That's the history, and we looked at the red tape, and then we said, you know what can we do now? And so Dan Ash, as well as John Jarvis said, well, we can't do anything because our funds are restricted to our lands. But we have Governor Schweitzer. Governor Schweitzer is banging on our door, and there goes the letter writing campaign that goes back and forth, 5 or 6 letters back and forth between the Salazar and Governor Schweitzer. Governor Schweitzer is dealing with his own politics with the Montana legislature, the livestock growers, and so we know that the bison are going to be leaving the park soon. What are we going to do about that? Well, let's call up the Confederation Kootenai. Well, Confederation Kootenai says, well, we're actually working on the bison range. And well, Governor Schweitzer said that you guys would like to get those bison moved over to the bison range. And they said, well, that'd be a great idea, but what about the genetic diversity? We have our own Allard herd that have its own significant history, and we'd like to maintain that population. And they said, well, Governor Schweitzer would like that. Well, what do we do? What do we do? So what came down to it is the funding that Governor Schweitzer promised tribes, he couldn't get through his legislature, even though he had a lot of surplus. The Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service couldn't fund it because of the regulations. And so it came to Indian Affairs. Indian Affairs said, we'll pony up the money. Meaning that we put up close to $500,000 so that tribes could transport and construct quarantine facilities on the reservations. And that was the solution. So we executed it. Now, there was no fanfare, there was no press about this, but what occurred next was the transport of these 66 bison from Yellowstone quarantine facility to the Fort Peck Indian Reservation. And that's the first time that this genetically pure herd would be allowed to transport and move from Yellowstone National Park to a reservation. Now, other federal facilities throughout the country, Wyoming, Nebraska, South Dakota, other reservations in Wyoming, said, we'll take them. And Governor Schweitzer said, no, these are staying in Montana. I'm going to, not allow any Fish and Wildlife Service fish to be transported off federal lands. Orders. It became a urinating contest between the Salazar administration and the Schweitzer administration. But we became very confident in ourselves that we could do this. So we did. And that really is a success of understanding the boundaries, but also understanding how we can collaborate despite the red tape. Now, I talked about that, and there's some of the letters. I'll provide those to you guys. But the Secretary Salazar had support from his assistant secretary, and this is me and Larry Echohawk. He had the trust and foresight to think, these are my team that come from the West. As you know, Mr. Echohawk was a former AG, former candidate for Idaho governorship, and professor at BYU. And this was his team. These are me and other attorneys that made up the Indian Affairs. We were the attorneys that advised Indian Affairs on solutions, even though we weren't necessarily invited to the table. We were a resource, and we raised our hand and said tribes have always wanted to participate in the relocation and prevention of slaughter of bison from Yellowstone National Park. And so Del Lavador and myself made our way out to Fort Peck for the ceremony, for the relocation. Del's in the middle, and then you can see me. So we're there. And so we made the trek out there, and it was powerful to see that occur. Now, you know, Dan Ash and John Jarvis, they're great individuals, they're smart, they're good at what they do, and they've been in the federal government for years, decades. But when it came down to it, they were restrained because of the red tape. And our story is that when Salazar, as a leader, said, yes, fish are important, yes, bison are important, but within the Indian Affairs, BIA is the only agency within his department that deals with people, and we need to make them a priority. And by helping bison, we help Indian people. And so when we got back to Fort Peck, the chairman at the time, Floyd Azure, stated that never in his ancestors' mind, never in our minds as Indian people, when we entered the Treaty of Laramie of 1868, did we think that as long as the buffalo roam, did we ever think or visualize that the buffalo could not roam? As long as the grass grows, as long as the fish run the streams. All of those were unfathomable for Indian people, but they became a reality, and it was all due to man. So to have the rebirth of the notion that bison have lived the same struggle as Indian people and were able to return back to their homeland was very powerful. And the funny thing is that, and I'll finish up with this, is that, you know, the Governor Schweitzer will take all the credit, which is fine, but he was the catalyst because he had a deliverable politically. You know, yeah, he would pound his, you know, do the drumbeat, you know, guys heard the canned speeches talking about, you know, Indians can come in the front door, no longer the back door. I have more Indians in my cabinet than any other before. That's great. But in terms of substance, it was difficult because of the politics and the bison and the heritage of Montana history and the American Indian history. So I'll close by saying that I love my time at the Department of Interior. And this is just one example of how we transcended not only the political boundaries of politics between the state of Montana and national politics at Interior, but we also worked with tribes. And tribes, being the silent, being in the back, were always there and always available to be a resource, an outlet, to be a part of the solution. And if it makes sense in our theme here in transcending those boundaries, you know, we went from federal land, the bison went from the federal National Park Service land through state land, transportation, you know, through Montana up to Fort Peck to land back on tribal trust lands. And the funding allowed that to happen. And that's the power of having a support from a administration through a stroke of a pen can allocate funds. And it may seem insignificant because it's not going to catch the headlines, but for me as a Grizz working at the Department of Interior, that's me sporting the Grizz gear at Department of Interior, yes. Me on the Metro, you know, commuting 2 hours every day to go there, and then having Obama saying, hey, come back, Dion. No. This is me and Salazar. We got to play basketball together. And in Montana, you know, basketball is a religion. And that's where we connected a lot. You know, he felt the need to be there for Indian people, and he was. And through me, I was able to help Indian people, not only across the country, but right here in my own home state. And it gave me a sense of pride. So that's me again. We played the Department of Education, and I always rep the UM gear. You can see that. And we lost. Arnie Duncan's really good. I don't know if you guys know that. Yeah. But, and plus he recruits guys from D1 schools. That's not fair. But it was fun. The other resources that I wanted to point out, this DOI report came out. It's part of the literature I'll provide. The DOI Bison report looking forward. And yes, I am listed on there. So, yeah, I'm part of the report. And some of the resources, there's a great YouTube video talking about the documentary and a little bit of politics that I'll provide for the presentation when I'm done. But that's my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you guys invite me back. I love coming back to Missoula. John and Brian, if you guys can let me know about any jobs up there, I would appreciate it. Flathead. Thank you.
Thank you, Dion. How come you didn't have a picture up there with you hugging the governor of Montana, too? That's next time. Right. So, when we're talking about success stories and natural resource management issues, we know they come in different shapes and sizes, and success can come in parts. So we haven't solved the bison issue across the board. I would say we still have a lot of work to do there, but Dion gave an example of a way to break it down and find success where you can. And then we can build on that going forward. So what was the catalyst here? Well, it was the winter of 1996. It was probably the governor's executive order. Brucellosis. Maybe there were a number of catalysts here. I'm not sure, Eric, if they were all shared catalysts. Maybe that's why we haven't come to a full solution on bison issues. Who was the messenger? I heard that it was really important to have the Bureau of Indian Affairs, that the messenger was able to get something done and be creative in a way that the agencies that are so stovepiped in their sandboxes have a hard time doing without here BIA reaching across them. Creativity was crucial to solving this issue and getting bison, moving them from Yellowstone National Park Service jurisdiction to the tribes. And then humanity. I think humanity was the driver here, the leadership, Secretary Salazar, and the states played a crucial role too. I really want to open this up to question, because as I look in the audience, I see so many experts in wildlife law and people who've worked on this issue for years and on the ground, and you have a lot to add to this conversation. So let's open it up to questions. If you would raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone, that would be great. I know you guys out there, and I know you know these issues, so you must have questions. Martin. Dr. Knight. If you speak loudly, but here comes a mic.
Professor Noggle, thank you for all your efforts in sage-grouse conservation. It's commendable. I did want to ask you if you could just elaborate a little bit on your framing of things in terms of voluntary conservation, and that you put up the slide of all of the decisions not to list and delisting of some species. In every one of those cases, it's not so much voluntary conservation as much as it's voluntary conservation through coercion of the Endangered Species Act. And in a lot of those cases, it's also the money that has gone into various recovery efforts, such as sage-grouse. So if you could just elaborate a little bit on how you see this as being a voluntary initiative.
Martin's right. And so I think the value of the Endangered Species Act is when you can wave the hammer but not club somebody over the head with it, would be my short answer. But then there's still the question of, can you make an initiative inclusive? Can it be organic? And will people want to come and play in that sandbox that doesn't have the property lines included in it? And that's where I think some breakthroughs are coming, where, like in the sage-grouse initiative, 1,129 landowners enrolled right now. I mean, that's a massive chunk of ranches. It's an area equivalent to 2 Yellowstone National Parks, yet it's all working lands. And so this is what's feeding America. It's what's fueling Western economies. And if you can play the 80-20 rule, you're going to win every time because of that. And the 80-20 rule, right, is let's not start a conservation conversation with the 20% that divides us. Let's do the 80% that unites us. And I think it's these frames of mind where you enter these conversations where we can change some value sets and find that common ground. Martha was great on the fence marking thing's a nickel and dime thing. We can reduce collisions. It's not going to change the West, but it's a great place to start a conversation. And then you talk about a grazing system, and then you talk about long-term perpetual protective measures like conservation easements. And those are long-term conversations, and I think having those 20 and 30 and 40 and multi-generational conversations, that's where we're gonna do the things out here that make everybody want to live out here, because it is the biggest, it is the most, and it's the last big intact place where we're going to win or lose these things.
Great question. It's so nice to frame the semantics here of what's truly voluntary. And is this voluntary? Something that's so fascinating about sage grouse and these other species, even though these agreements are in place, and I know the state people here may be able to help on that, it's just beginning. I mean, it's like the tip of the iceberg, right? The decision not to list is not the end point, as you know well. It's just the beginning of so much work that needs to now happen.
But we also know the decision not to list is going to be challenged because it's not voluntary enough before it's done.
So Martin just raises a great issue. All of these decisions, so many of these decisions, all of my students in public lands and wildlife hear this too much. Almost every decision made under the Endangered Species Act is litigated. Seriously, almost every is, from both sides. And you can argue that litigation forces the agency to be more honest and make better decisions. I'm not saying there isn't a role for that litigation, but you're right that the decision not to list will be challenged probably from both sides. So I think it's going to be groundbreaking case law. Maybe it'll take place in the District Court of Montana, Federal District Court here. And maybe some of our fine students will be clerking and will elucidate those answers. So any other questions? Yes, Professor Johnstone.
So picking up, it seems like one common thread is that there was a whole lot of money to throw at the problem. And we've just seen a major conservation fund be defeated in the budgetary process. We're likely to have, for structural reasons with respect to the House and the presidency, to likely to have continued budget battles in the future. And I just wonder to what extent the fact that we're unable to have long-term federal budgeting anymore might pose challenges in the future that might not have existed in the past when you've been able to have all this money to solve these problems. What happens when that money dries up because of the climate in DC and the failure to budget at the federal level?
And just to be more specific, Professor Johnstone, I think it's referring to the Land and Water Conservation Fund that just sunsetted, was not reauthorized. And I heard money come up. Funding seemed to be one of those key ingredients to the special sauce.
I can talk a little bit about that because some of the battles, largest battles obviously are occurring with budget priorities. And I think your question goes to the heart of what we consider the political dynamics between bipartisan or partisan politics. And I think that's why it's so important that we recognize that who we elect as senators, as congressmen, or even to the presidency, their priorities are really going to be what are at stake with the upcoming election. And the notion that your vote doesn't count, the notion that you know, the DC politics or the DC economics doesn't affect us out in the West couldn't be farthest from the truth. I tell my students this summer that the West and Department of Interior and the things that make national headlines, we are on the cutting edge of the biology of the Indian war of battles, and that the DC norm, they don't really understand that, and that the funding of these initiatives, whether it's the Intertribal Bison Corporation, whether it's conservation groups, whether it's Planned Parenthood, all have an impact on us as members of the society, but also as constituents of our local communities. And so when we look at the budget priorities, we tend to fall in line with what works for us locally. And I think that if we understood that what we decide here matters in DC, it really does. And I think, you know, that couldn't have been demonstrated more than, you know, when Senator Conrad Burns was defeated by Senator Tester. And the change in the momentum from a Republican majority to a Democratic majority. And I think I can't impart on you most because, first of all, you're all here. And I don't really have a worry about you guys here because you guys are educated or you want to be educated, and that's why you're here. I'm worried about your constituents, your colleagues, your friends that aren't here. What are you going to do on your part to educate them to say, hey, this matters, this issue matters? Your friends, your neighbors, your family. And that, to me, is how you make an impact and how you can really strengthen and protect those things that we consider important here. So that's a kind of a political thing. So, but
Yes, Paul.
I think one way to answer the question about the lack of you know, public funding for this is to think about, so we have the Public Land and Resources Law Review here. And when you're thinking about public land and public resources, we're providing permission for people to use those resources. And imposing terms on that permission that requires the people that have the most direct economic benefit from the use of those public resources to contribute funds towards their management, I think is appropriate. So it sort of goes back to my comments at the beginning about the River Tweed. If you want to use navigable waters for a dam to store water that you're going to sell and electricity you're going to sell, you may need to make certain improvements in terms of how you manage it for fish. That's the condition of getting access to it. That's not going to work on private lands quite as well, but I think as we think about public lands and navigable waters and public resources, in addition to trying to find support for additional public funding, we can also look to have some of those costs borne by the people that are benefiting most directly from being provided that access.
Yeah, we focus more on the winning recipe, and then we let our external partners go and fight the funding for us. And so we have 40 additional field staff that we've placed in those priority areas for conservation. We pay for part of their salary through Farm Bill funds, but then there's 40 additional paying partners that pay the other half. And we've already fought some of the funding battles, and when it looks like something could be slipping away, the steps at USDA and at cabinet levels have kept those spigots open. And so I think if you focus on the winning recipe and you document your outcomes and you continue to scale up those benefits, I think that some of those funding battles, you'll never win them internally. When we go to DC, I get to talk to a staff member. When the landowner goes, he talks to his congressman and his senator. And I think that's how the organic private land component of this bubbles up to the top.
That's a great conclusion. I see that. Well, there's one more question. Do we want to go on? We're out of time. One more question, that would be great.
Yeah, everybody seems to feel that people are part of this equation, or an important part of this equation. And what I'm wondering is, other than the legal coercion that we discussed earlier, has anybody found a successful way to communicate restoration priorities and get community involvement in restoration projects? That's it.
That's a good question for you, Dave.
When this approach gets truly institutionalized, I think what you're going to see is it's replicated at watershed, state, and then you'll have some national priorities. And so what we're seeing is something that we call conservation envy, and it's really what makes you sleep at night. And so what you see are watershed groups watching that list that Martin brought up, right? And so the answer isn't recovering a species or not getting listed. It's that they're listening to those other producers and landowners, and they're getting conservation envy going. I see where you live. I see where your community is supported. It's more stable. Your economic condition is secure. Why can't I have that in my backyard? And that's where these things are starting to get replicated. And they're working on things that don't have anything to do with ESA or regulatory top-down approaches. They're working on making their own lives better. And I think that's maybe penultimate success.
I think a great example also, our class does a field trip to the Blackfoot Challenge. And I think that's an example for grizzly bear restoration of a community learning to tolerate and live with grizzly bears and fold it into the way they live. So I think there are lots of examples across the West of how necessary it is for communities to have buy-in for restoring those species, whether it's wolves, grizzly bears, Arctic grayling.
Yeah, I would echo that envy, conservation envy. And I want to point to the Confederation Kootenai because they've done some really great restoration projects along their watershed systems, and they've actually won a couple of awards. And I had the opportunity to tour them, and I guess the biodiversity aspects, but also when I think about Yellowstone National Park and wolves and the ability to prevent watersheds from being pounded out by grazers or browsers, and a natural predator being able to essentially manage that just by a mere presence. I think when we talk about bison, it's not only the restoration of a natural or native species to its homelands, but it's also culturally significant to Indian people. And I think the message that we talk about community involvement or community support is that there isn't an intent for Indians or buffalo to roam the entire plains again. It's the fact that it maintains a culturally significant to the Indian people. And that culturally, we respect the diversity not only of biology and ecosystems, but also for individual cultures and heritages. And we can understand those and respect those and still live together. And I think that's where I think we can find a common thread. And that understanding, it doesn't mean that one is better than the other or one is worse than the other. It's just that it's diverse, and then we can all coexist.
So I think that's a nice way to conclude the wildlife panel, and that's with that human component. And we'll lob it to the next panel, the energy and climate panel, and see where they lead us in today's discussion.